From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power alongside Kaylee Lines. I'm Joe Matthew as we bring you a live look of southern Texas, where SpaceX is counting down to the launch of the 6th test flight of its Starship rocket. Taking off just seconds from now, SpaceX looking to duplicate the success of the previous mission, in which the booster known as the Super Heavy was caught safely after separating from the Starship. Joining us now, Bloomberg's Bruce Einhorn, Wendy Benjaminson, and former NASA astronaut Leroy Chiao. Kaylee, we are just seconds away from watching this begin. It'll be about 7 minutes from launch to the recovery of the booster.
Yep, just 3, 2, 1. We are seeing now the countdown begin. Let's listen in.
Vehicle is pitching downrange.
Booster Raptor, chamber pressure nominal.
With a live look over southern Texas now, the Gulf Coast of Texas, the rocket easily clearing the tower as we head for altitude here. We're hearing live sound from Mission Control, remembering that this launch system, comprised of the Super Heavy booster and the Starship, stand roughly 400 feet tall. This is like launching a 35-story building, Kaylee, and it's going to follow a similar profile to what we saw in the last flight, number 5, but will re-enter the atmosphere at a steeper angle. They're trying to test upgraded heat shield technology on this rocket today.
Yeah, keeping in mind that we will see the actual Starship separating from that Super Heavy booster, which is expected to return back to the ground in controlled fashion, as we saw in the 5th flight test, which will be caught by the chopsticks. And we should keep in mind, as we watch all of this play out, it's still heading, of course, directly upward into orbit. Donald Trump, the president-elect, is in Boca Chica, Texas, along with Elon Musk and a number of other high-profile lawmakers, to watch this in action as it happens. Pretty remarkable that the president-elect, with his close relationship with the SpaceX executive and America's richest man, is there to witness it.
It's really something. Just a few nights after they came together at Madison Square Garden to watch a UFC fight, they are now watching what is expected to be an historic launch here. And for those of you with us on Bloomberg TV and on YouTube, we're showing you a live look of the president-elect here. If you're with us on the radio, we're watching the rocket reach its highest altitude. In the last test flight, it was 93.2 miles, and they are expected to duplicate that here as we end the mission with the Super Heavy booster captured, as Kaylee said, by the chopsticks. We're going to get into what's called the hot staging portion of the mission here, in which we prepare for actual separation here. Most of the engines will next be cut off, Kaylee, and this is a very delicate part of the maneuver as they start to flip the rocket over for separation.
Yeah, so as we see here the images and listen into the commentary of the separation beginning with the Starship moving on and the Super Heavy booster now making its journey back to Earth again as it tries to have a controlled descent into those mechanical arms. Let's turn now to Bloomberg's Bruce Einhorn, who is watching this and listening to it in real time with us. So, Bruce, how critical is these next few minutes as the Super Heavy booster tries to make another controlled journey back to Earth?
Well, the next big moment we'll be seeing will be coming up very soon. That's what they call the hot stage jettison, in which part of the rocket the booster will be jettisoned off the side. This is something that over the longer term, SpaceX intends to get rid of. It will be fully integrated into the booster. At this moment, though, this is they will be jettisoning that. That's coming up.
These are remarkable visuals that we're looking at as the booster is in position here to begin its controlled descent. We want to bring in former NASA astronaut Leroy Chiao, who is watching this along with us here. Live visuals on Bloomberg TV and on YouTube. And for those of you listening on the radio, we want to carry you through this. It's great to have you back, Leroy Chiao. What we're going to see here in the next couple of minutes is an attempt to recreate the capturing of this heavy booster with the so-called chopsticks on the pad. Speak to us about the stakes here, the risk of pulling this off, because SpaceX made it look pretty easy last time.
Well, that's right. And that was what was amazing. On the very first attempt, they were able to catch the booster. Remember, this booster is more powerful than the Saturn V moon rockets and more powerful than NASA's SLS, Space Launch System rocket. And they were able to catch this booster, showing that they can recover it intact and refurbish and reuse it. And the disruptive thing about this whole Starship system is it's fully reusable. It's going to dramatically bring down launch costs. Think about Starship as a super space shuttle. It's not quite there yet, but it's pretty amazing what it can do. It's going to be much more capable. It's going to be able to go out of Earth orbit, unlike the space shuttle. And we're going to watch the Starship. Hopefully, it's the modifications to the control surfaces and the heat shielding. It will survive re-entry with no burn-throughs, unlike last time, and it's going to do the flip and the hover, showing that it also can be captured. So really remarkable stuff going. This is really exciting.
A headline just crossing the Bloomberg terminal that SpaceX has scrapped plans for the super heavy mid-air booster catch. Remember, that did happen successfully in the fifth test flight. It was caught between the chopsticks, but they have scrapped plans now for that mid-air booster catch. Leroy, if you could just react to that. Obviously, I would imagine these things are incredibly difficult to execute even under perfect conditions. But what does that signal to you?
Well, there are a number of different parameters that have to be met in order for them to try. So obviously one of those parameters, or one or more, have been violated. So I guess, I'm hearing it from you right now. They're not going to actually attempt to catch it, which means it will splash down in the Gulf of Mexico. But nonetheless, we're really interested in seeing what the Starship does. Hopefully they've got their heat shield problems worked out, and they will keep incrementally advancing as they go flight test to flight test. This is number 6, and it's, they have successfully, kind of furthered the success with each flight. So disappointing that we're not going to see them catch the booster again, but how the Starship does.
For a soft splashdown.
As the booster descends, apparently not for the catch here. Let's listen live for a moment to control.
Entering, we saw earlier those grid fins. There are 4 hypersonic grid fins. Or we can see that the landing burn has begun on the super heavy booster.
Same pattern, 13 engines will light.
Plume come out from beneath the booster as it makes its way closer to the ground. A large tongue of flame as we see the horizon. Not expected, again, to be caught descending into the Gulf of Mexico. A splashdown instead of a catch on the chopsticks. Bloomberg's Bruce Einhorn, you can explain that does not mean mission failure. We still have something else important to test here.
That's right. And to add some important context here, as easy as SpaceX made it look last time with the catching of the booster by the chopsticks, obviously it was incredibly difficult. And Elon Musk himself afterwards on X did say that it did come very close to not working out well. So the fact that they didn't attempt it this time is an indication of just how difficult this is, a reminder of just how impressive the performance was last time.
Well, certainly, I think a lot of us were impressed last time, including perhaps the president-elect, who, as we mentioned, is there to witness this today, having formed a very close relationship with the leader of SpaceX, Elon Musk. And Leroy, I would love for you to weigh in as we are testing out this Starship system, in part because NASA would like to use this in future endeavors, including getting back to the moon. How concerned should we be about the relationship between the president-elect, the incoming president of the United States, the role Elon Musk will have, at least in an advisory capacity in government, knowing that he, too, and this is exhibit of it, is a big government contractor?
Well, sure. And, I should clarify that as far as the government contracts go, as far as Crew Dragon and Falcon 9, those were prepayments made under what was called the CC-DEV program by NASA. And so it really wasn't a contract per se as much as it was prepayments on delivery of sending cargo and now crew to the space station and returning them. And they've been doing that consistently. And so Starship, yes, they do have a contract to help develop lander based on Starship technology, and so they are intertwined. So there is a question of conflict of interest. How can there not be? And so that would have to be worked out how all those nuances happen.
If you're just joining us here on Balance of Power, something a little bit different as we bring you the 6th test flight of SpaceX's Starship rocket system. We have gone through launch, which was successful. It appears that the heavy booster is in the water now in the Gulf of Mexico, as opposed to achieving the chopsticks capture that we saw in Test Flight 5. Those of you with us on Bloomberg TV and on YouTube see the president-elect now with the red MAGA hat talking with Elon Musk, who's explaining to him what's happening as they look out over the Gulf of Mexico. Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson is with us in Washington as well. As we look at all of this unfold here, Wendy, it's hard to underscore the politics and the impact of these visuals following the outcome of this election and the role that Elon Musk will play in this administration.
Absolutely. This is sort of the bromance tour continuing. They went, as you noted earlier, they went to the UFC fight together. Now Trump has gone out to Texas to see Elon Musk's launch. It's just more of this constancy that the two of them have together lately in terms of everything, not only having fun together like they are this week, but also choosing their cabinet, choosing Trump's cabinet. I mean, Musk is acting almost as a shadow vice president, or not a shadow vice president. He's acting as a vice president to Trump. We've heard a lot more from Elon Musk about the government in the last couple of weeks than we have J.D. Vance.
Yeah, of course, he will be co-leading this new Department of Government Efficiency, even though it won't necessarily be a real department or part of the U.S. Government. It's really just an advisory capacity we're talking about here. But, Bruce, it is worth keeping in mind that as we discuss these contracts for SpaceX, there are other operators in this game. We know things have recently gone wrong with Boeing, and SpaceX will be relied upon to get astronauts home from the International Space Station. Blue Origin is here as well. Just how far ahead is SpaceX in this race at this time?
Very far ahead, the short answer. Blue Origin is trying to catch up. They have their big rocket called the New Glenn that they're hoping to have their first launch soon. But for now, SpaceX is really the only game in town when it comes to getting astronauts to and from the space station, for instance. SpaceX operates by far the world's largest, most advanced low Earth orbit communications network, well ahead of anybody else. And they're in the process of testing out the world's biggest rocket. The fact that they weren't able to land the booster in the chopsticks, I think, is also important to keep in mind that SpaceX's Gwynne Shotwell, number 2 behind Elon Musk at the company, said just last week that the company hopes to be launching hundreds of times over the next few years. Being able to catch the rocket or have the rocket return on land, the booster part of the rocket, is critical to that in order for them to be able to have the fast turnaround, to have that frequent number of launches. So the fact that they weren't able to do this, do the landing on land this time is certainly a setback. It's far too early to say, of course, just how big of a setback it is, but clearly it would have been better for them if they had been able to pull this off, having it return to land rather than splash down in the water.
Well, we do have to remember that there are 2 astronauts stranded at the International Space Station, Leroy Chiao. I wonder your thoughts on the future and the contrast that we're seeing here between SpaceX and Boeing. What is the future of Boeing in space?
It's difficult to say. There have been rumors that Boeing is looking to sell their space division. Of course, Boeing makes most of their money on commercial airplanes, and the new CEO seems to be focusing on that, which perhaps is the right thing to do. On the other hand, it's a big blow to Boeing to say, okay, we give up on space and commercial space, and we're going to cede that to SpaceX. NASA would provide or would prefer to have two providers to be able to get to the ISS. Right now, SpaceX has been very successful in doing that. Boeing faltered several times, including this last time stranding Butch and Sonny on the ISS until February, when they're going to come down on a SpaceX vehicle. So, things are not great for Boeing. Hopefully they can recover and come back to their engineering roots and make it more about engineering excellence rather than dollars and cents. So, we're hopeful that that's going to happen. But Starship is far and away much more advanced. And the fact that this is, flight test number 6, even though they didn't catch the booster, like I said, let's see how the Starship does. I anticipate the Starship will, the heat shield and the modifications that were made will be successful. But that's the next big objective to look at.
And finally, Leroy, that obviously is the most immediate objective here that we will see play out this evening if all goes well. But there are longer-term objectives here for Elon Musk as well. We know his end goal is Mars. As we all discuss here today and watch this still underway as the Starship continues to orbit here, how far away are we from that moment?
Well, Elon Musk in both SpaceX, Tesla, and other ventures tends to be a little over-optimistic, but I think he does that to drive his teams to work as hard as they can. So even though we may not get to Mars as quickly as he thinks, we will get there. I mean, I think history has shown, don't count him out when he talks about recovering boosters, which all the experts, including me back in the day, didn't think was possible, but now he's doing it on a routine basis. It's pretty incredible. This is history in the making. I mean, this is flight test number 6, which is pretty phenomenal. That flight test number 5 was just about 6 weeks ago. So I expect this pace to continue, break things, fix them, and ultimately this system will be operational. It'll be a big disruptor.
All right, Leroy Chiao, former NASA astronaut, thank you so much. Joining us along with Bloomberg's Bruce Einhorn and Wendy Benjaminson. Wendy is going to be sticking with us, though, because coming up, we still have to talk about what happened elsewhere in politics today. Even though Donald Trump is currently in Texas, he's rolling out more cabinet picks, some of whom are with him there. We'll have more next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington. Thank you for joining us as we turn to the Trump transition. Another busy day with Cantor Fitzgerald Chair and CEO Howard Lutnick selected by the president-elect as the incoming Commerce Secretary. Lutnick, until recently, had been thought to be one of the top contenders for Treasury Secretary. We now at least know he will not be, although Treasury still has to be announced. And joining us is Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson, who's helping us cover all of this in Washington. Wendy, we got another one. Dr. Oz to lead the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services.
Yeah.
Is this a day for normal, Team Normal, based on some of the other names we've heard?
No. There was, Howard Lutnick as Commerce Secretary is certainly within the realm of normal. Dr. Oz is an unusual pick. He was a professor of medicine at Columbia University. I mean, he's an actual doctor, not just one on TV. But he has spent a good deal of his career in the last 10 years promoting, sort of fringe medical things, a lot of wellness stuff that isn't quite, on the beam with a lot of the medical community, including hydroxychloroquine, which was a disproven COVID treatment back in the day. So, that will be a very interesting pick. He'll be working closely with RFK Jr., if they are confirmed, who will be the Health and Human Services Secretary. And I think we're in for a real sea change in the relationship between Americans' health and their government.
Well, so as we consider the questions around confirmation here, it's not clear whether RFK Jr. is necessarily going to have an easy path to get the requisite votes in the Senate. Howard Lutnick, though, to your point, might have a little bit of a smoother way forward. Not that the process to get here has been smooth. He was jockeying for Treasury quite publicly. Now he gets Commerce. We still don't know who gets Treasury. But if he was having somewhat combative relations with another Treasury candidate, Scott Bessent, in public. If he's Commerce, does that mean Bessent's not likely to get Treasury because they're going to have seats at the same table? That might get feisty.
That might get feisty. It might get, but people also get over these things too, you know, once it's over. But Bessent has also been touted as a possible National Economic Council chairman, but he wanted to see who the Treasury Secretary would be first. And so I think a lot of this is now all hanging on the Treasury Secretary, which seems to be down to Mark Rowan of Apollo Global Management and Kevin Warsh, a former federal chairman. Both of those also perfectly within the range of normal. And I think while Trump has made some interesting and almost funny picks on some of the cabinet secretaries, he really wants to be close to Wall Street. He wants to be taken seriously by Wall Street, and Treasury Secretary is one where he's not going to play around. So the candidates will all be in this realm of people that Wall Street can get behind in one way or another.
In the meantime, he's calling individual senators to talk about some of the other names that we've been chewing on here on this program. Matt Gaetz, Pete Hegseth, Tulsi Gabbard, and others. Gaetz specifically, though, could have a bumpy day tomorrow. The House Ethics Committee is meeting on whether to release the report into some pretty grisly accusations against him.
Absolutely. And the lawyer representing some women who had accused Matt Gaetz of sexual misconduct is making all the rounds, saying what they testified to in the report that is unreleased, which is that they have testified that they saw Matt Gaetz having sex with a girl who was 17 years old, and taking drugs. He has absolutely denied this, firmly denied this. He was not charged by the Justice Department. I feel like we have to say that. But nevertheless, that does make a bumpy road for confirmation. And there are plenty of Republican senators who are feeling conflicted about what to do. But Donald Trump so far is not giving up on him. And he is, as you said, making those calls.
All right, Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson with the latest on the transition. Thank you so much. Turning our attention now to the war between Ukraine and Russia, which is now in its 1,000th day. Ukraine, for the first time, has fired long-range U.S.-supplied missiles into Russia, an escalation of their response. And at the G20 summit in Brazil, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov reacted.
If long-range missiles are going to be applied from Ukraine into Russian territory, it will also mean that they are operated by American experts, military experts. And we will be taking this as a qualitatively new phase of the Western war against Russia.
And of course, Russia also has made moves. Vladimir Putin signed a decree allowing Russia to fire nuclear weapons in response to a conventional attack on its soil. Joining us now with more from the G20 in Brazil is Bloomberg's David Gura. So, David, what has the reaction been like to both of these developments on the ground?
Well, this had a seismic effect on the G20 summit here in Rio de Janeiro, and we should go back and look at what precipitated all of this. The United States in particular was very upset at the prospect of North Korean troops being used by Russia to fight in that conflict against Ukraine. That's what led the U.S. to make that authorization, one that they didn't go out and confirm on the record. Of course, we've seen what's happened since, and that statement from Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, incredibly strong, and I'll point out in English, it was meant to be a very strong warning to Western leaders who are gathered here about that change to the nuclear doctrine that you were just alluding to, Kayleigh. So you look at sort of how things were before. It was if a nuclear power attacked Russia, that would be grounds for them to retaliate in kind. What they've stipulated in this new document is if a non-nuclear nation were to attack Russia in concert with a nuclear power, that would give them the ability to react in kind. And that's an extraordinary statement, at least rhetorically, and one that really affected people here on the ground and was the subject of conversation on the sidelines of the summit today. There was a big meeting this morning between Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany, and President Xi Jinping, in which this was discussed. President Xi Jinping didn't talk about the latest developments in great detail, but acknowledged the conflict in Ukraine during the course of his remarks before that conversation. Olaf Scholz, I'll remind everyone, just had a conversation with President Putin of Russia, and a lot of people here were eager to hear how that conversation went by telephone. Others were upset with him for having it in the first place, wondering why it happened when it did, especially in the context of what's happened over these last few hours. So we've heard from some global leaders here on the heels of this escalation of what's happened in that war. Others have remained silent, and I'll say chiefly President Biden said nothing. He did not have a press conference while he was here and didn't deliver a statement to the press while he was here either. what we have to look to is this communique that was developed by the members of the G20 who were here, that formal declaration from the 20 member states who gathered here in Brazil. Ukraine is mentioned or alluded to, but that conflict is not mentioned in real specific, and that is something that the president of Brazil really wanted to emphasize. He wanted to see there be a communique. There have been summits like this in the past where there hasn't been one. He was adamant that there would be one. So when there was the opening for debate about words and language related to the conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East, he really scuttled that, moved along. We have that document, but it tells us precious little about where things go from here. And that indeed is the open question. With Donald Trump returning to the Oval Office in just a couple of months, how things will change here as a result, and folks here confused and worried about the prospects of what that might be.
Bloomberg's David Gura live in Rio tonight. David, thank you for your reporting all week. If you're just joining us on Balance of Power, we've had a successful launch of SpaceX's Starship with the Super Heavy booster, but a bit of a change in the plan. After launch, the rocket did clear the tower. It's still, in fact, underway right now as we wait for a splashdown in the Indian Ocean. The booster not caught today by the chopsticks. It ended up in the Gulf of Mexico. We're going to have a lot more ahead with what we've been discussing with David Gura and the impact of Ukraine's move today and Russia's nuclear doctrine with Evelyn Farkas, Executive Director of the McCain Institute, next on Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We must push Russia toward just peace. Every blow and every threat from Russia must be met with firm sanctions. For 1,000 days, it has been crucial to radically reduce Russia's ability to fund its war through oil sales.
Ukrainian President Zelensky earlier today, on this day that marks the 1,000th day of the war in Ukraine, and the first time Ukraine fires U.S.-supplied long-range missiles into Russia, having just received permission from the U.S. to use them offensively, as we discussed at this time yesterday. Joining us now for more on this, Evelyn Farkas, Executive Director at the McCain Institute and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia and Ukraine. Evelyn, it's great to have you back. I wonder your thoughts on the timing here, the use of these ATACMS, because it certainly got the attention of Russia implementing a new nuclear doctrine in response, hearing people talk about Article 5 all over again in Eastern Europe today. Was this well-timed to strengthen Ukraine's hand at the negotiating table, or a poor decision to do this late in the game?
Well, thanks for having me on again, Joe. I think it was definitely well-timed, although I would say it could have come a lot sooner. So I don't believe it's escalatory. What Vladimir Putin has been doing, again, threatening to use nuclear force and raising the nuclear, dagger, if you will, is the escalatory factor here. So in providing this new permission, if you will, the White House is basically trying to strengthen Ukraine's hand. There's a recognition that under President-elect Trump, there will be an effort to make peace. And in order for the peace to be fair and to be durable, the Ukrainian government needs to make sure that it can hold on to territory as a bargaining chip, and that's where these weapons come into play.
Well, how quickly, though, can they make a difference in that effort when we're just 2 months away from a second Trump presidency, Evelyn? It's one thing to use the ATACMS once, arguably, they were not incredibly successful in doing so. Russia intercepted 5 of the 6.
Well, Kayleigh, though, one of them hit a depot, an ammunition depot, and caused massive explosions. So that's a lot of ammunition that Vladimir Putin won't be able to feed into his war machine. And the idea is to make sure that he knows that time's not on his side. But the other aspect of this, as I mentioned, is that Ukraine wants to hold on to a piece of territory that it seized in Russia. And that's where the Russian government now is putting the new North Korean forces. So if Ukraine can use the long-range artillery to hit those North Korean forces, it can hold on to the territory. It can also send a very strong signal to North Korea and any other friends of Russia that might be considering sending their own personnel in to help Russia.
What's going to happen in Ukraine between now and January 20th, the inaugural, and the extent to which Vladimir Putin could exploit this period of time while Joe Biden is still in office?
Well, first of all, I think that Ukraine could exploit this period of time. The U.S. government is sending shipments in, Joe, as fast as possible. They've provided this permission. I think we'll also see sanctions. But of course, there's always a danger that Vladimir Putin will, send those North Koreans in, slaughter the Ukrainians. That would obviously be distressing. And Vladimir Putin has been conducting sabotage operations all over Europe. Just this past week, we believe it looks likely that the Russians cut some undersea cables. This is incredibly alarming. We've had, officials in Europe refer to it as hybrid warfare. Warfare. So Russia is really playing with fire right now in terms of its actions vis-a-vis the United States and our NATO allies.
Well, and when we focus on its action in terms of the revision to the nuclear doctrine that we learned about today, Evelyn, Sergei Lavrov, when speaking at the G20, said Russia would like to not see nuclear war taking place. And I just wonder if you really do think Russia's attitude about what would qualify as justification for use of these weapons has really changed, or if this is just bluster and signaling more than anything.
I mean, to my mind, it's bluster and signaling, because I cannot imagine a Russian military and a Russian political establishment actually sanctioning the use of a military weapon, or a nuclear weapon, or some kind of nuclear explosion in and around Ukraine. That would provide immediate literal fallout, on Russian forces and Russian civilians, but also political fallout. And internationally, it would be widely condemned. Putin can't foresee what the risk would be to him, even maintaining his position in Russia. So I think the idea that the Russian government would follow through on such a threat is, to my mind, the likelihood is not very high. It's incredibly reckless of the Russian president, again, to make these kind of threats. So he's clearly desperate, Kayleigh. I look at this as a sign of weakness, frankly. Every time he makes these threats, it's when he feels like he doesn't have a better option.
Does Volodymyr Zelensky need to meet with President-elect Trump as soon as possible?
Well, he met with him recently, Joe, during the campaign. So I don't know that there's a rush to do that. I think that it'll be interesting to see how President Trump approaches this, because I think we have to take him at his word that he does want peace. The question is whether he can get a real peace, a lasting peace, and a peace that's fair. The key to this, of course, will be providing Ukraine with some kind of security guarantee. And if President Trump isn't going to back NATO membership for Ukraine, which, by the way, I think all NATO members now, except the United States, have agreed behind the closed doors that they would be open to that. If President Trump doesn't want that, then President Trump's going to have to offer a bilateral security agreement like the one we have with Japan and South Korea and others. So I think it'll be interesting to watch President Trump's negotiating position as it develops. I'm hopeful that he will actually help Ukraine at the negotiating table in the end, because the only way is for Putin to understand he can't continue waging this war against Ukraine. He will not win.
Well, and as we consider that the president-elect wants to see an end not just to this war, but the one in the Middle East as well, Evelyn, I wonder if you think peace there might be able to come sooner, perhaps even before he takes office. Obviously, there was reporting that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu wanted to deliver a ceasefire in Lebanon as a kind of gift to the incoming president. But the U.S. does have a plan on the table now. It does seem like we may be getting closer to that moment, but I wonder what your view is.
Yeah, I mean, my guess is, I'm going to be cynical here. I know that the Biden administration is working very hard. They have their special envoy, Amos Hochstein, in there negotiating the agreement. Having said that, again, cynically, I think that the Netanyahu government will drag it out so that they can give this win to President Trump as president. Maybe they'll do it sooner, but they'll still try to tie it up in a bow and deliver it to President Trump, which is fine. At the end of the day, we want peace, and if that's how they want to present their acquiescence to the compromise deal, that's fine. That should be fine with everyone concerned.
All right, Evelyn Farkas, Executive Director at the McCain Institute and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia and Ukraine, thank you so much for joining us. Coming up, President-elect Trump attends the SpaceX launch in Texas alongside Elon Musk. It, of course, was successful, and we'll have more on the political implications with our panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. The SpaceX Starship test flight still underway after a successful launch of the Starship and its Super Heavy booster that has splashed down into the Gulf of Mexico instead of being caught by the chopsticks. But of course, viewing the show today, along with our audience here on Bloomberg TV and radio as well, was Donald Trump, who was there in Boca Chica, Texas, alongside Elon Musk, who, of course, runs SpaceX. And joining us now for more on the political implications here is tonight's panel, Ashley Davis, founding partner at Westfront Strategies and Republican strategist, alongside Kevin Walling, vice president at HG Creative and Democratic strategist. Welcome to you both. I would love to talk about whether you two would like to venture into space one day, but I want to talk really about what was happening on the ground. Looking up at the rocket, Donald Trump standing shoulder to shoulder, Ashley, with Elon Musk, who he obviously has grown very close to, but considering SpaceX is doing this in part through contracts with NASA, talk to us about the conflict of interest here, or not, that you might see.
I don't know. I mean, I think that Elon has done, like him or not, he's done an amazing job, obviously with Tesla, obviously with SpaceX, and he's doing better than the government is in regards to what he's doing in space. So I don't think there's any problem with it. More importantly, though, I do think the senators that were around, Senator Kramer, Senator Haggerty, Senator Ted Cruz, I thought that was what I was watching.
Yeah, there was quite an entourage.
Yeah, who needs a courthouse in New York when you can go to a rocket launch and get everybody together? What do you make of this? Is this a conflict of interest from the viewpoint of a Democrat and abuse of power, or something wonderful to celebrate that happened today in America?
Well, certainly I'm with Ashley in terms of I love the notion of the commercialization of space competition, right? You have more businesses investing, rocket technology getting better and better. I do think there's going to be some serious fault lines when it comes to this takeover 62 days from now, where you have, as Wendy Benjamin described in a previous block, this shadow vice president in Elon Musk, who's going to be charged with some serious responsibilities. Obviously, it's going to be the case of how much Donald Trump will cede to him. I think. Well, it'll be also interesting 62 days from now if Elon is still the chosen shadow vice president, because as we know, Donald Trump does not like to share the spotlight with anyone, let alone the richest man in the world. So we'll see how that dynamic plays out.
But he's supposed to lead the Doge until July 4th, 2026.
To the moon.
But you think there could be a rift here?
I think there's certainly going to be a rift in terms of those personalities. Of course, Vivek Ramaswamy is going to be his counterpart on that. They're obviously going around any kind of oversight issue with regards to background checks. Obviously, they're not a normal cabinet position. So it will be all up to how much Donald Trump empowers this Doge caucus committee organization to look into government funding and waste.
They will probably make everyone go back to work 5 days a week, and then they'll just get rid of all the government waste right there. Everyone will quit.
Interesting. I hadn't thought about that. So what comes out of the Doge, and what makes us think that Donald Trump, or Congress for that matter, will actually listen?
I agree with Kevin with this 100%. I think it's going to be hard. Obviously, there's going to be recommendations, but as I've said many times, there's going to be a whole union issue when they're dealing with the federal government and what they want to do, if they want to cut employees, if they want to cut programs. And
when it comes to workers and
and actually money that goes to the federal government. Are there programs, especially under the past administration, that are more liberal policies they'll probably definitely say they'll get rid of? But Congress has to do that as well. They're going to have to approve it. And I think with the slim majority in the House and I still think it's a slim majority in the Senate, it's going to be hard to do. But there'll be a lot of noise. And I also think Elon will have another project and he'll probably not be interested in, after his 18 months.
Okay.
Well, I guess we'll find out come the summer of 2026, perhaps, or sooner. We'll all have to stay tuned, just like we're still staying tuned for more cabinet picks for the second Trump administration. We did get two new ones today, Howard Lutnick for Commerce and Dr. Mehmet Oz to run Medicare and Medicaid. We'll have reaction from our political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
The Ethics Committee has the authority to release that report, and I think what scares a lot of us is that we saw the last time that Trump was in the White House that he not only surrounds himself with sexual predators, people who are credibly accused of sexual assault, but suppresses that information.
I think I'm safe in saying that President Trump would like to see him have his confirmation hearing and get a shot. His chance to respond will be a confirmation hearing.
I think that if they want a speedy consideration of this nomination, we've got to have as much transparency as we can.
We're creating a false crisis because the reality is all that information is going to be on display at the hearing. Think Brett Kavanaugh. I'm going to hold my folks to the same standard I would hold Democrat nominees.
As Democratic Congressman Sean Casten talking with us earlier today, along with Republican Senators Josh Hawley, Chuck Grassley, Tom Tillis, earlier, talking about the House Ethics Report on former Congressman and Donald Trump's pick for Attorney General, Matt Gaetz. The House Ethics Committee meets tomorrow to vote on the potential release of this report, and we reassemble our political panel for their take. Ashley Davis and Kevin Walling are with us at the table. Kevin, this appears to be the worst-kept secret in Washington. If you're a lawmaker and you want to know what's in that report, you can just pick up the nearest tip sheet or read the Washington Post. There's going to be an FBI background check that goes into this confirmation hearing. What's all the hand-wringing over releasing this report?
We think there will likely be it might not necessarily be the case, Joe, that they go with that FBI background check, even for the Attorney General.
You're thinking about
who
a recess appointment or something.
Well, that too.
Yeah.
And I think, the interesting thing, Ashley just pointed out the senators at that launch. One of them was Kevin Cramer, who you just quoted, who said, it's unwise to put anyone up there through that recess process if they can't get the majority of the majority with 53 Republican votes. It's been 17 years since we've had a recess appointment. And it's been interesting to see the Republican senators kind of almost reassert themselves. The House and the Senate, for decades has been fine ceding power to the executive. But we'll see, especially with these more controversial nominations, if they stand their ground.
Well, and the question, I guess, is how many nominees they're willing to stand their ground for, Ashley. There's a few controversial ones that we could pick from, but this incoming Senate leadership does want to align itself, at least they've said, with the president very closely. So can they really only afford to shoot down Matt Gaetz?
Yeah, but I think the most obviously DOD is controversial, and we'll see what happens there, but also even with RFK, which I'm laughing because I called him JFK with you the other day. But, he's been vetted once under Obama. So that's when he was up for EPA. So, his vetting may not be as hard. I just think that you have Mitch McConnell, Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins. Those are your three votes. And I think McConnell is not going to I think he's going to make sure that he speaks, and he can. He's up for re-election in 2026. He's probably not going to run, and he's going to be a thorn in the side. And there's three senators right there. Yeah. So I don't think many will fall. I think Matt Gaetz falls.
So a recess appointment is not going to be...
I just don't believe... So I've been really looking into recess appointments and how it actually can happen. It's a great talking point.
The stars have to align.
They have to align. They have to align in the House as well, not just the Senate. And also with the very slim majority, especially with some of the members of Congress that will be nominated, or that are nominated for cabinet positions, they're only going to be up one or two for several months. And so I would say these... Brian Fitzpatrick from Pennsylvania, these moderate Democrats that maybe would not vote to go into a recess appointment from the House perspective. Right. So I don't think it's as dire as many are saying.
All right, fair enough. Well, the other thing many are talking about, at least, is the dance here for Treasury Secretary, because there is still a lot of jockeying over this position. Donald Trump has not yet made up his mind, but he has ruled one person out officially by nominating him to be Commerce Secretary instead. Yeah. Howard Lutnick, who, of course, leads Cantor Fitzgerald, currently, obviously very close on Wall Street. And we understand he wants the same out of Treasury. And I wonder what the length of time it has come to make this decision just for Commerce, still leaving Treasury hanging out there, signals to you, Kevin.
Yeah, it's interesting. And, of course, there's news reports that he's had a few other contenders down to Mar-a-Lago to meet with him for that Treasury spot. Of course, this has been a record in terms of appointments coming this quickly after election. I think Anthony Blinken in the last administration was appointed or nominated 3 weeks after the election. So I think we're in this kind of whirlwind right now around Trump, where they're coming fast and furious. No one's safe, leaving their phone down at 6 p.m. because there's even more appointments that are likely to come tonight as well. But it is interesting that this is the one real serious position that's been left open thus far.
What do we think of the delay in terms of making the markets happy? It is funny that we're all waiting around. We expect all this done. And by the way, it is just 2 weeks today, as Kaylee reminded us.
It's extraordinary.
Exactly. A little bit scary. But Donald Trump is afraid to have the wrong person in this job, to have the wrong temper for the markets, to maybe have somebody too pro-tariff for Wall Street so he can take that lane. Is that how we describe the next Treasury Secretary? Someone who's more palatable to the market than Trump himself?
Maybe. I mean, I don't know if he's putting that much thought into
Robert
that
Lighthizer,
side.
for instance, was taken off the list because he was too friendly with tariffs for the market.
Exactly. And I do understand that. I think he's actually just looking for somebody that he can gel with. I mean, there's been a lot of lobbying for this position, which I don't think he likes. I was very surprised today with the Lutnick announcement at Commerce, because I am a huge fan of Linda McMahon, and I thought she was going to get that. It looks like she gets Education or Ambassador of the UK, but she'll get something. But I think it's a very serious position, and he thinks that this, obviously, Treasury is going to be very important, as you say, for CFIUS in regards to, that they play a huge role in regards to foreign investment, obviously for the economy and also for tariffs. And so I think he wants someone serious. And again, I think that this is all our rhetoric, as well as that's like the position that's not named. But he does have almost an entire cabinet filled in 2 weeks. True. Not all of them will be confirmed, maybe.
Yeah, well, a very good point. It's also interesting to note when he announced Howard Lutnick's nomination for Commerce Secretary, he said in the statement he'll have additional direct responsibility for the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, which is not usually structurally how that works. So we could potentially hear Kevin be talking about kind of a realignment of the order of command here.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And you also saw that with the Doug Burgum announcement, that some traditional things that have been under the Department of Energy will be ceded to Interior based on that appointment of Doug Burgum. And again, I think he's playing these personalities off one another, and we'll see different territory based on the personalities, to Ashley's point, that he clicks with.
We should mention, by the way, Joe Livornia was talking with us earlier, and he took issue with this idea of infighting over the Treasury pick. He said they're taking a minute here. Should everyone just calm down? Is that the moral of the story?
I think so. I mean, I think that it's just fine. But from what I understand, the lobbying of some of these has really turned him off, from what I'm hearing from kind of inside the transition.
So you can overstep.
Yes, and I mean, let's talk about Oz. I mean, Kevin and I were talking about this before we got on. I think it's a great pick. I had some emails like, what? But Oz is like a serious... I got to know him fairly well when he ran for Senate. I think he's a serious pick. I think he actually could be utilized even differently. CMS is kind of a snore sometimes, but it's very important. And I'm getting the music in my ear, so I need to stop talking.
We could talk to you two all night, but unfortunately we do have to leave it there. Ashley Davis and Kevin Walling, thank you so much for joining us. You can get more coverage in the Washington Edition newsletter, and we'll be back tomorrow, Joe.
Yeah, and watching that rocket. See you back here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.